Hello, everyone, and welcome to SUNUP. I'm Lyndall Stout. Oklahoma and the southern Great Plains have a long and storied history with wind erosion, and that's where we begin today, talking about how the wind still affects agricultural production. Here's our OSU Extension Soil Conservation Specialist, Dr. Daniel Adamson.
Hello, I'm Daniel Adamson. I'm the State Specialist for Soil Conservation and Management. And if you're like me, you were probably getting around the state this year and you noticed some really dry and windy days this March. And during those dry, windy days, I couldn't help but see a lot of wind erosion happening throughout Oklahoma. So I thought it was worth talking about wind erosion today and how we are still dealing with this problem even almost 100 years after the Dust Bowl. So wind erosion at its core is fairly easy to understand, and it really boils down to the fact of, does the wind actually reach the soil, and is it windy enough down at the soil surface to cause erosion to start? Erosion on soil surfaces really won't begin until you get a minimum 8 to 10 mile an hour wind just about 6 inches off the soil surface. So you can have a pretty windy or breezy day like here, but as you go down, obviously there's not a bunch of wind there. So it has to be a pretty windy day up here. So we have a lot of different examples of types of soil surfaces here at the agronomy farm that can teach us something about wind erosion. So right here we just have a little alley. It's bare, it's exposed. This is kind of the ideal surface for wind erosion because it's smooth and there's nothing protecting the soil surface or slowing that wind down. So it's easy for it to get started on a windy day. It's especially worse if you would have just done some tillage or something and that soil surface is loose and dry and friable. So I brought my own wind today for demonstration purposes. So I just have an air compressor here. We can just take a look at if you get enough wind force at the soil surface and if it's very smooth, it's really easy to start moving that wind around. So what we see is a dust cloud. That dust cloud is more of the small soil particles. Those are the ones that can move a long distance. What's harder to see are those bouncing sand grains. And if I put my hand here, I can really feel those small sands hitting my hand and really blasting my hand. So imagine that process going forward all day and hitting some of these other soil aggregates. As they get sand blasted, it's breaking up more and more soil particles, making the soil even looser. And then as that windy day continues, the process just gets worse and worse as the erosion moves across the field. So here's another example of a different kind of soil surface and landscape surface for that matter. And what's important here is that any type of roughness to the surface on the small scale, like this more freshly tilled soil, and on the large scale, like if you have a windbreak nearby or a shelter belt of trees, is that anything that can slow that overall wind speed down does a lot of good in reducing soil erosion. On the small scale here though, it's harder to get an actually fast wind at the soil surface because these rough and bumpy surfaces are going to break up the wind stream and actually cause it to be a little more turbulent. You can kind of blow on this, and if you can look closely, you'll notice I am moving some soil around, but as it moves, I can kind of trap some of those soil particles in these gullies and ridges between different tillage areas. So as a final example, we are on a field here that has some wheat straw on it from last year. We've also burned down some weeds and a bit of an old cover crop that we had on the agronomy farm before summer cropping season comes. So this is a good example of just how powerful it is to have even just a little bit of cover on the soil surface to avoid wind erosion. And that cover can be both living cover, perennial grass cover, something like this is ideal. But even just retaining a little residue goes a long way, and it's as simple as it seems. If you have something on the soil surface that's going to protect it and shield it from the wind, and it's going to make it harder to lift and raise those particles and move them around. Also, it's going to be harder to kind of sandblast other soil particles if you have some cover protecting the soil, so you don't get that massive movement of soil creeping and moving along the field. So as a final demonstration here, just looking at how we can kind of try and blow the soil surface here. And we can try and start to move some soil particles around, but we just have some anchoring of particles from the plant residue. Obviously, even better if we get into a living plant canopy. So obviously even more erosion protection when we have a living plant canopy with a lot of residue on the surface. And even if you have a barrier of vertically growing plants, that's going to slow the wind speed right at the soil surface and really help keep that soil in place. So overall, wind erosion is a pretty simple concept to think about. And if we just keep our soils covered, it goes a long way to improving and maintaining our soil health. We want our nutrients, we want the best part of our soil to stay right here to improve the productivity of our land. And if it blows away, that's just productivity that we've been working on for a long time that's no longer in our field. So I hope you consider some of these things as we move toward next year and those periods of time when you have to have some bare soil in between crops. Keep it covered as much as you can.